Complicity. What does it mean? The dictionary defines complicity as the state of being involved with others in an illegal activity or wrongdoing. Complicit behavior has been on full display for the last several months, hell, for the last several years. Remember back to Baltimore, after Freddie Gray died while in police custody. Mayor Stephanie Rawlings Blake, who, quote, also gave those who wish to destroy space to do that as well, end quote, along with protecting legitimate protesters. Even going back to 2014 and the Ferguson riots, media and city leaders worked to downplay the violence, the arsons, the damage done to minority communities and minority-owned businesses. We see it on display over and over again. Community leaders and media go out of their way to downplay violent actors and equate them to harmless sign holders. In Minneapolis, we saw journalists like Ali Velshi standing in front of a raging fire and referring to the riots as, quote, mostly peaceful protests. Mostly peaceful protests that caused millions of dollars in property damage, including the destruction of an affordable housing project. 90 some odd apartments gone, wiped away, erased before they could house a single minority family. And so it goes, on and on, round and round. However, the worst part is that it seems our political leaders are doing more than tacit approval and turning a blind eye to the violence. It seems that there are cases in which they're trying to stir up the violence. And this takes me back to George Floyd and the actions of Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison. Now, I have to be very clear. I am not condoning the actions of the police during that arrest. However, new evidence is coming to light, such as the fact that the medical examiner announced that a lethal level of fentanyl was in Floyd's tox screen. Add to that body cam footage of Floyd in the back of the cop car and sitting on the ground saying that he couldn't breathe before Chauvin's knee got anywhere near his neck. So now you have 4 cops who will be tried together, one of who is charged with second-degree murder. Now you have information that any bottom of the class, barely past the bar public defender with no experience could dismantle these charges with. So now comes a question of the intent of why overcharge. Keeping in mind Keith Ellison's history as an activist and a leftist bomb thrower, it stands to reason he would use his office to create a dangerous situation before the election. Overcharge Chauvin. Fail to get the guilty verdict. And then the city erupts, just like LA after the 4 acquittals in the Rodney King case. I know this kind of tinfoil hat territory. But look at some of these Soros-funded activist prosecutors and attorneys general. St. Louis DA Kim Gardner, who went after Governor Greitens and got him to resign over fake charges that he was later cleared up. The same Kimmy Poo that is now prosecuting big-time Democratic donors for having the audacity to demonstrate the willingness to use force to protect their mansion after violent protesters crashed the gate of a private neighborhood to go protest at the mayor's house. Now, in Kenosha, another potentially bad shooting. Now, I have done my best on social media to keep my opinions on the actual shooting to myself, as I simply don't know the details. Yes, I know Jacob Blake was brawling with the officers. I do know he had a sexual assault arrest warrant out on him. I know he refused to comply with officers ordering him to stop walking away from them, all while having sidearms drawn and pointed at him. I know he appeared to lunge for something in his car before being shot in the back. Now, on the surface, it appears to have been a bad shoot. Even with the news coming out that, yes, he was in fact going for a knife, which they found in the floorboard of the driver's side of his vehicle. I think it still could have been resolved by tasing him. There's also reports that he had been tased and he just shook it off. So I don't know. And this is just my opinion. I know law enforcement officers have to make split-second choices that can mean life or death. I've had to make choices like that while in Afghanistan. And fortunately, none of them ended in the loss of my life or livelihood, or the same for any of my soldiers. Now, almost immediately, rioting broke out. Car lots were destroyed, even as they had Black Lives Matter signs hanging on their windows. The local Unitarian Universalist church, with their profession of the importance of Black lives on the church sign, was burned down. It's an amazing picture. Seeing that church burning, the church sign melting, and it says Black Lives Matter. Obviously, the church didn't. But where was law enforcement? Firefighters were unable to reach these businesses, so owners were having to hook up power washers, in some cases, to put out the flames. After the first night of the riots, Governor Evers refused to send in more National Guard troops to reestablish order. So then citizens were forced to take up arms in order to defend their property. Enter Kyle Rittenhouse, a 17-year-old kid who went to Kenosha, as with many other out-of-town protesters. Rittenhouse spent his afternoon in Kenosha scrubbing graffiti off the sides of high schools, and then took his aid bag and AR-15 to a friend's business. The business had been damaged the night before, and he, along with other impromptu militiamen, were trying to keep the rioters from finishing what they started. Rittenhouse was interviewed by a couple of intrepid reporters, including the Blaze's Elijah Schaefer. During these short interviews, he stated that he supported the protest. However, he didn't support the riots and was willing to provide first aid to anyone who needed it. When asked about the rifle, he said he wasn't dumb. He knew he was going into harm's way and he needed to be able to defend himself. During his interview with Schaefer, he said he had already been pepper sprayed by the crowd. And then he walked off in the mid-interview to provide first aid. He was later accosted and called words that I will not repeat, and repeatedly attacked. This isn't a matter of speculation or conjecture. This is on video. When he felt his life was threatened, especially after a gunshot rang out during the constant haranguing, he reacted. The results of which have been plastered all over the news. Outlets such as Reuters, The Washington Post, Vox, and others would have us all believe he was a white supremacist. Hell, that's the first thing I heard, was that a white supremacist was shooting black people. No, he wasn't a white supremacist, and he shot all white guys. Even today, a BLM Incorporated organizer was making the accusation that he had shot kids. Forget the fact that all three were nearly twice his age. But I'm not just here to kvetch about the goings-on in Kenosha. We have seen the spin from the media from all over. They use the fact that, yes, the overwhelming majority of protesters are in fact peaceful, to couch the claim of mostly peaceful protests. They provide cover for the anarchists, the agents provocateur, and the anti-fascist black shirts, and the looters. Local, state, and federal leaders downplay the violence. Congressman Jerry Nadler quite publicly stated that, quote, Antifa is a myth, end quote. Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler has allowed the Antifa violence since 2016. During the past several months of the attacks on the federal building in Portland, he has painted the federal officers protecting the property and the lives inside that building as the aggressors. He even went out of his way to attend one of the peaceful protests at the federal building, where he was shocked that he was tear-gassed as federal agents tried to disperse the rioters. Just like when they got the media to show up and film all the moms standing between the fence and the protesters, to spin the story about how bad the government forces were. Seattle had the Chop Chaz, and it was allowed to continue by the mayor for several weeks. Well, until the protesters showed up on her front stoop. As of today, protesters are at Ted Wheeler's apartment complex, turning on him. They are the proletariat, turning on the bourgeois socialists. Again, St. Louis, we saw protesters crash the private community to take the protest to the mayor's house. Then those two Democrats walked out on their front step with guns drawn, all hell broke loose. Missouri's castle doctrine doesn't explicitly ban brandishing firearms to deter a potential violent act, which is what they did. But in true political fashion, DA Kim Gardner has sought to prosecute them for a non-crime. This is the complicit behavior we have to watch out for. We have to be on the lookout for allowing behavior that would be abhorrent on all sides. Sure, Ammon and Cliven Bundy were protesting Bureau of Land Management and their policies towards ranchers and grazing on federal land. Then there's the standoff at the federal park in Oregon. Now, while we may have agreed on the principles they were standing up for, the way in which they went about it was incredibly hostile. And like how all the BLM protests have led to the deaths of 36 men, women, and children over the past several months, a supporter of the Bundy siege in Oregon was killed. Not by the protesters, but by federal agents when they crashed through a roadblock trying to get to that park. This has been a hard message. We like to think, oh, we're not doing that. We're above that fray. Can you believe what they let them get away with? But we have to make sure we turn the mirror on ourselves. Make sure that we hold ourselves to account for our own complicit behaviors. Whether it's always supporting the police in shooting incidents, regardless of the circumstances of the shoot. And I've seen it where if they just complied, they wouldn't have got shot. It's like they were complying. Like the kid who got shot in the back and killed he was on his knees trying to follow orders from a cop that were damn near impossible. The Kenosha police shooting of Jacob Blake is one of those moments. I know we're all prone to making judgment calls. It's part of our nature. But our nature doesn't always lead us in the best directions. Edmund Burke once said, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing."